This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW, flyers. That is 2 or 3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 667, entitled Men, do your, in brackets, masculist bit. Description. This flyer encourages men to do their bit, their masculist bit. That is, to help contribute to the growing masculist consciousness by learning the essential ideas of masculism so that they can counter the awful monoconscious bigotry of the feminists who preach to society that gender oppression is a one-way street, when the masculists know that gender oppression is very much a two-way street, and that in reality women oppress men worse. This flyer contains a Cliff Notes type summary of the core ideas of masculism so they can be spread easily to millions of men and women, raising their awareness that men are oppressed by women's horrible gender crimes against them, e.g. manslavery, divorce, rape, forced fathering, etc., so that when there are millions of masculists and MGTOWs, society can move on into the second major historical phase of masculism, that is, the men-fairing of the gender laws. For example, the establishment of GECs, GECs, gender equality committees in the parliaments, that then legislate the that's paternity rejection right, the OPTAB, OPTAB, obligatory paternity testing at birth for all births, to block women's paternity fraud, etc. The GECs will push for the FIPping of women, the creation of a FIP Society that will go a long way to liberating men from the major gender crimes that women commit against men. Now for the flyer itself. Men, do your, in brackets, masculist bit, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. During World War II, the Brits had an expression of doing their bit, that is, contributing to the war effort. This flyer promotes the idea that men, millions of men, should do their bit in spreading masculist ideas, so that millions, later billions of men can be liberated from the current gender oppressions that are inflicted upon them. For a man to do his bit, common sense says that he first needs to know that he is oppressed. In other words, he needs to know at least a smither of what masculist ideas contain. So I present here the Cliff Notes description of the core masculist ideas so that any male can see their strength and relevance to millions of men. Masculists are men's libbers, the male equivalent of feminists. That is, masculists are out to liberate men from the oppressions of the traditional male role of being a man's slave to a woman, working for her for decades of his life. Over a century ago, this traditional man-slave role of the man made sense. There was a certain inevitability about it. Since the Industrial Revolution, the steam engine, the factory system, etc., broke up the extended multi-generational family, forcing families to consist of the father, the mother, and many kids, that is, the nuclear family. With no contraception, and with 1 in 2 children dying at a young age, women had many children. My own mother had 11 other siblings. So it was a full-time job for the mother, who had to stay at home to look after her tribe of kids. So who earned the money to pay the rent and buy the food to keep the whole family financially afloat? ? The obvious answer, of course, was the father, the husband, the breadwinner. As the decades passed, the pill was invented that men gave to women. Household gadgets were invented by men and given to women. men increasingly applied the scientific method to medicine, resulting in women now having a life expectancy of 85 years. And the pill allowed women to choose the number of kids they wanted, which nowadays is typically 0, 1 or 2. So women now have a career window of half a century, if one does the math, even if the woman stays at home for a few years while the children are very small. When I was a postdoc in Japan in the 90s, I observed that the Japanese husbands would overwork, putting in 11-hour working days plus 3 hours commuting time, and some of them even died of overwork, something the Japanese call karoshi. If these men were upper middle class, the type of men I was working with, often their wives, whose children were off their hands, did not work at all, prompting my coining of the expression, quote, "In Japan, the husbands overwork and the wives play tennis." End quote. The Japs are not known for their creativity, having the reputation of being a copycat culture and being gender role retards. They are decades behind the West in terms of their thinking about the battle between the sexes, so it did not occur to them to start thinking in masculist terms, seeing women as manslavers who live off the labour and money of a man for decades of his life. The core idea of masculism is that it is a rebellion by men against being man-slaves to women, working for women for decades of a man's life. So masculists put tremendous moral pressure on women to get off their fat parasitic asses and FIP up, that is, become FIPs, that's financially independent persons, so that they do not man-slave men. Masculists are abolitionists, seeing man-slavery as literally 1,000 times bigger problem than was Negro slavery in the US in the earlier 1800s, given the numbers. There were several million Negro slaves in the US at the time, and there are several billion man-slaves in the world today. Masculists, particularly masculist theorists, are very conscious that many of men's gender issues, for example, women's manslavery of men, women's divorce rape of men, women's forced fathering, etc., would be removed if we all lived in a FIP society, that is, one in which everyone, particularly girls, are socialised and educated to be FIPs by getting a career competent education in high school and college, so that these women could be FIPs as adults and not expect fluffy style, in brackets, fluffy equals, traditional woman who expects to live off the money and labour of a man for decades of his life, close brackets, thus manslaving him for decades, a major gender crime as seen by the masculists. One father in 4 gets butchered in the fluffy feminist controlled divorce courts that the feminists took over in the 70s, seeing divorcing fathers merely as cash machines, forced to continue to pay for divorcing fluffies after the divorce the way they did before the divorce. Typically, a father in many Western countries will lose custody of his kids with a 90% probability. He will lose his house so that his ex-wife can raise her kids in it. He will lose half of his wealth and stuff to her. He'll be forced to make payments to his children, whom he will barely be allowed to see, maybe 2 weekends a month. If his ex-wife is a real fluffy, he may be forced to pay her alimony for the rest of his life, with no legal nor moral obligation on her to get off of her fat parasitic ass and FIP up, so that she continues to parasite off him after the divorce the way she did before the divorce. Masculists see fluffies as manslaving, divorce-raping vermin, and have such a hatred of them for the massive gender injustices that they commit against men, that masculists effectively exterminate such women by punishing them so severely that these women rot on the shelf, utterly rejected by masculisted men, not even pumped and dumped, thus forced to die slow, miserable deaths, manless, sexless, loveless, babyless, etc. There are other horrible gender crimes that women commit against men that last decades. For example, forced fathering, where a woman forces a man to pay for a kid that he doesn't want. For example, women's pill lying and women's paternity fraud. A woman pill lies when she tells her man that she's on the pill but isn't, because she wants to get pregnant and he doesn't. so she gets pregnant and then forces the man via a paternity suit to pay for the kid until it is an adult. Paternity fraud is when the woman lies to her man that the kid growing in her is his, when she knows it's not. Thus the man is then forced to pay for a kid that, in capital letters, is not even his. Masculists want paternity fraudster women to be put in jail for 15 years, since paternity fraud is a worse gender crime than rape, that typically gets a man put in jail for 10 years. These big three gender crimes are the worst that women commit against men and are hated by masculists. Masculist theorists see that by living in a FIP society, these big three gender crimes, and many others, that women commit against men would be removed. Obviously, if all women are raised to be FIPs, then manslavery would cease to exist, since women would earn their own money. Divorce rape would stop, since divorce would be based on the principle of financial independence of the divorcing mothers. Masculists push for the legislation of the paternity rejection right, which would give men the same right to reject an unwanted pregnancy that women have with their MARA, aka abortion right. Thus, in today's world, women have the legislated right to reject an unwanted pregnancy, but men don't, which causes masculists to feel a burning rage against its horrible gender injustice. Masculism is going through the same two major historical phases that women went through. That is, the initial consciousness-raising phase, followed by the political phase, in which gender laws were changed in favour of women, for example, equal pay for equal work, the right to enter the professions, the abortion right, that take over the divorce courts, removal of fault-driven divorce, the establishment of women's rights committees in the parliaments, etc. These new gender laws had a strong impact on women. Masculist theorists see clearly that men need to go through the same two major gender political phases regarding men's lib. Currently, men are still in the first phase, which is what this flyer is about. That is, pushing men to spread masculist ideas more vigorously so that millions of men can have their masculist consciousness raised, similar to what happened to women in Western countries in the late 60s and 70s. The men's movement, the manosphere, has yet to really move into the second phase, the political phase, because the first phase is still not sufficiently developed. Masculist theorists want the establishment of GECs, GECs, in the parliaments, in brackets, GEC, GEC equals Gender Equality Committee, that consists half of female feminist and half of male masculist politicians, whose job it is to ensure that the gender issues of both sexes, capital letters, are dealt with equally, capital letters, which is far from being the case today, since nearly all feminists are monoconscious. That is, the only gender politics they know of is feminist, since feminism is a deeply misandrist, gynocentric ideology that preaches to women that gender oppression is a one-way street. Feminism says nothing about how women oppress men, so it's not surprising that bi-conscious masculists have little patience nor tolerance for monoconscious feminists, who masculists see as MFBs, that's monoconscious feminazi bigots, who preach to the world that gender oppression is a one-way street, when in fact gender oppression is very much a two-way street, and that women oppress men worse, since the many gender crimes that women commit against men are horrible and last decades, for example, the big three mentioned above. Given this monoconsciousness of feminists, masculists have no patience with them and push men to become a lot better informed as to how women oppress men. So, men, do your, in brackets, masculist bit by helping spread masculist ideas. Absorb the main masculist ideas mentioned above, so that the next time you come across a misandrist, monoconscious feminist, you can not only counter her misandry with masculist arguments, you can crush her by telling her that women oppress men far worse, and tell her the details of that female oppression of men, of women's manslavery, of women's divorce rape, of women's forced fathering, which are hugely greater gender crimes than men's sexual harassment, men's domestic violence, even rape. These male gender crimes against women are small beer in comparison with women's horrible big three gender crimes against men. So men, become informed of masculist ideas. Intellectually arm yourself with masculist concepts so that you can educate a dozen of your friends and acquaintances into masculist ideas so that they in turn can do the same until nearly all men have had their masculist consciousness raised so that any educated person of either sex is fairly well informed of what the masculists are thinking. When that happens, the time will be ripe for the second major phase of masculist gender politics to begin, that is, the creation of the GECs, which then legislate the paternity rejection right, the OPTAB, OPTAB, obligatory paternity testing at birth for all births, to block women's paternity fraud, and push for the FIPping of women, for the creation of a FIP Society, for the fundamental reform of the divorce courts, where today one father in four gets butchered, having his life destroyed by the hated fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges who see divorcing fathers as cash machines to be robbed and abused. If you know the essential masculist ideas, then you are in a position to correct the monoconscious bigotry of any feminist you come across. You'll be able to educate her into the errors of her ways, her misguided feminist idea that gender oppression is a one-way street, which is the only gender politics she has heard of, and that if she doesn't become bi-conscious, in brackets, equals, familiar with both feminist and masculist arguments, close brackets, faster than the man in her life, then she will face a serious risk that that man will see her monoconsciousness with his new bi-consciousness as bigotry. He will become disgusted with her and dump her. So if millions of monoconscious feminists want to keep